So welcome to our second policy breakfast of the fall. We're here to talk about income volatility, housing instability, and housing assistance. There are some seats kind of over here, over here. So one of the most pressing policy issues across the nation is the affordability of housing. With almost half of the country's renters paying more than 30% of their income on rent, and therefore rent burden, there's been a divergence in the growth of housing costs and growth of incomes for decades. Since 1960, rents in real terms have increased 61%, while incomes only grew by 5%. High housing costs combined with low wage growth may exacerbate housing instability. The worst examples of this are evictions and homelessness, which create significant costs for individuals, families, and society at large. We also have evidence that shows that housing instability impacts other non-housing outcomes. For example, a large body of national research has shown that homeless and housing insecure children are more likely to change schools often, which can disrupt attendance and reduce academic achievement. In addition, researchers have found an association between housing instability and poorer health outcomes. Also, a 2018 study of low-income renters found that those who experienced homelessness or multiple moves or who were behind on their rent were more likely to report adverse health outcomes for themselves or their children. While general affordability challenges are important in the conversation about housing instability, an additional and less common issue you may hear about in public discussion of housing policy is that of volatility. Income and expense volatility, or what we'll refer to as net income volatility, poses unique challenges for policymakers as annual spikes and dips in income can compromise household budgets and disrupt bill payment. Rent, the highest fixed cost for renter households, may be particularly difficult to pay. Evidence shows that this volatility appears to have been increasing over time, at least for lower income households. Evidence also shows that families that experience this volatility report less savings and may face late bill payments and be subject to costly late fees and debt. The effect of all of this together undermines their household financial security. The scale of households subject to these risks may be tremendous. Based on a 2016 survey of 17 survey of 12,000 people, the Federal Reserve Board estimates that 40% of Americans could not afford a $400 emergency expense. There is also evidence that the volatility is quite extensive within a year. Monthly volatility may be quite common even among those with full-time employment. This may present an even larger financial challenge for paying a fixed monthly rent. Researchers Rachel Snyder and Jonathan Mordock closely followed the household finances of 235 low and moderate income families across the nation, which included families in New York City, over the course of a year, and found that irregular work schedules, unexpected reductions in work hours, and within-job earnings can drive volatility. And while we think of average monthly income and expenses for budgeting, in nearly half of the months in a year, these families' incomes were either 25% greater or less than their average monthly income. Here we show an example of the income volatility of one of the families tracked in the financial diaries. Income is not a static, consistent occurrence for Janice, this particular household. So if rental payments are a fixed monthly cost, income is volatile, and many people don't have the emergency savings to help self-insure rental payments, it creates amazing challenges for low-income households and requires inordinate financial skills in order to navigate this. We are particularly interested in this issue and how to address it. Current housing programs are not designed to address volatility and mostly focus on persistently low incomes. This is reflected in the way tenants' share of rents are calculated, which in public housing and for HUD's voucher program, they're generally set to be 30% of a household's income. This means that subsidies are higher for the lowest income households, but also, in theory, that if income fluctuates, the tenant's portion of the rent should as well. But it is unclear whether the subsidized rent provides protection from monthly net income volatility that arises from the swings in incomes and expenses. Furthermore, Most low-income households don't receive housing assistance, and yet face these same net income shocks. As such, we again look to understand whether there are ways to address these gaps. Here are two concrete examples of programs that have been created to address volatility. Pennsylvania's HEMAP program, or Homeowners Emergency Mortgage Assistance Program, addresses income shocks by providing temporary support to homeowners unable to pay their mortgage due to unexpected financial hardships. Also, DC Flex provides a shallow subsidy and spending flexibility to participating households in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, HEMAP intervenes prior to a foreclosure for a homeowner household. Key features of HEMAP that make it clear how it targets temporary difficulties with making mortgage payments rather than ongoing assistance are that it provides a loan to help homeowners with a good payment history and make it through a temporary period of hardship. It also requires homeowners to demonstrate a reasonable prospect of resuming mortgage payments within 24 months. And importantly, the program interacts with other unemployment insurance claims, helping policymakers narrow in on affected populations. I'll note as well that a Federal Reserve study on the program found that 80% of participants had retained ownership in a follow-up study. DC Flex, as I mentioned, is a pilot program at the moment in Washington, D.C. It serves a small number of households that essentially permit families to change the amount of subsidy that they rely on each month within the cap of the program. Eligible households are employed, earning 30% of Washington, D.C.'s median income, and have received homeless assistance in the past. The program allocates $7,200 a year to each participating family, who can decide how much of that subsidy to spend each month, up to their full rent amount only. For example, a challenging month might see a family use the full subsidy, but in a boom month, the family might use none of it. There are two built-in incentives in this program to not use the subsidy, the full subsidy each year. The first is that the family can withdraw $500 of leftover funds at the end of the year. At the end of a 4-year period, the family can withdraw any remaining savings that are left in their account. In addition to these two concrete housing policy examples, there has been evidence of a growing interest in a number of products, loans, and other types of interventions designed to help address income volatility. For example, like many cities, including New York, Chicago provides short-term assistance to families who may face evictions in the prospect of homelessness. These are often referred to as one-shot programs across the country. They explicitly target households for whom temporary assistance will help stabilize them. Recent research suggests that the temporary assistance may have been effective. Families who called the hotline in Chicago when emergency assistance was available were 76% less likely to end up in a homeless shelter after 6 months. Note, this assistance is not through an existing housing program. It is only available to low-income households in crisis. So, with that information, we have an excellent panel ready to have our discussion. We'll delve into the issues of housing instability and income volatility and discuss how housing policies and new tools could potentially help provide a buffer for households that prevents housing instability and outcomes that we do not want, such as evictions and homelessness. So with that, I'll welcome the panel to the stage. If shoe volatility as well. So we have, I think, the perfect bunch to have this discussion. To my direct right is Molly Park. Molly is the first Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Department of Homeless Services. To Molly's right is Adrian Todman. Adrian is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. To Adrian's right, we have Brendan O'Flaherty, known as Dan O'Flaherty. He's Professor of Economics at Columbia University. And then at the end, Steve Mott is the Chief of Staff at Help USA. So we're going to start with discussing volatility itself and how it affects low-income households. I just presented some background on the prevalence of income volatility, and year-to-year income volatility may be increasing more for low-income households. Month-to-month volatility is likely high, and expense volatility, or what we often call shocks, are making things worse. And most low-income households don't have the savings to create a buffer. So let's talk about what people are seeing on the ground, and Steve, we'll start with you. Is net income volatility a sizable issue for the households that you work with?
Sure. Thank you. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad to be talking about this. This is something that I think the people that we serve deal with a lot, and it doesn't get talked a lot about in these specific scientific terms. So I think it's great to give a name to something and actually have real conversations about it. So to give you a 30-second background on what Help USA is, we're a nonprofit in New York. We're pretty big for a human service nonprofit. We have about 1,500 employees in New York and across the country, mostly on the Northeast. And we're a housing nonprofit, so we basically do three things. We build low-income affordable housing and manage it. We run homeless shelters, and we do homelessness prevention. And so, at some point during this conversation, I'll put on different hats and talk about different things. But I want to start by talking about our prevention work, because I think it's the most interesting when I think about the times that we touch people who are in housing crisis who haven't tipped over the point until they're in shelter. And this is a point where we really see a lot of income and expense volatility specifically. And the thing that people come to us, and I have a million stories, and I'll just tell one, but the thing that people tell us over and over again is that there's some event in their life, there's something that happens that tips them off of the trajectory where they're just barely being able to make rent, they're just barely being able to pay their expenses. And so, a typical family that we see is a single parent with two kids who comes into one of our home-based centers looking for assistance. And the story that they usually tell has something to do with an unexpected medical expense, a funeral that they have to pay for a relative who died somewhere else. And it's not about whether or not they're employed. They're mostly employed, right? It's not about whether or not they have a place to live. Most of the time they have a place to live and they're being evicted or in the process of being evicted. It's really about, how do I figure out how to get $800 and also pay my rent? And so, I think this dividing, what your median income is and what you can sort of make work every week with what you can actually make work for 2 months in a row is really important to our clients. And it's a lot of the reason that people walk into our home-based centers and ask us for help.
So Molly, maybe I can follow up with you from your perspective at your new position.
Sure. I think my perspective is going to very much echo what was just said. To put a couple of numbers on that, for the families in our DHS shelter system, right, so I'm specifically at this point talking about families, not single adults, at any given moment, about a third, a little more than a third of those families are employed, but over the last year, about half of those families have been employed, right? So right there, you are absolutely seeing fluctuation in income because employment is coming in and out. The typical family in the DHS system is a young mother with 1 or 2 kids, relatively low educational attainment, 42% don't have a high school diploma, right? So the jobs that folks are going to be working, it's going to be a lot of hourly work, it's going to be inconsistent numbers of hours, low wage, and it doesn't take a lot. I think I'm really echoing what Stephen just said, to tip somebody into a real crisis situation. And I think sort of when we talk about expense volatility, what kind of expense rises to that definition of volatility there, right? It's not a lot, right? There are certainly extreme medical bills, other kinds of situations, but it can also be something as simple as, clothes for school, right? Because when your base income is so low, there's just not a lot of flexibility there.
And maybe, Steve or Molly, I can ask a quick follow-up. I mean, do you have a sense of what households are doing to manage the situation?
Sure. So there's, I don't know if we're going to talk about this later, but what's interesting about people that we serve is that they're very smart about how they manage their finances, what they choose to pay and what they don't choose to pay. And so there's this real ranking of income and expenses. And so People use credit cards a lot. People use waiting, things that they know that they'll still get service on for 60 days, for 90 days. And the problem becomes when one of those expenses needs to bump in line over the other ones. And so people aren't doing great paying their rent, paying everything they need, but they're doing okay. And so then the problem is that when you're managing at such a low level, you're managing basically at subsistence, when there's something that jumps in line and your rent gets bumped down, right? So if you have to pay for a funeral of a loved one, that's the top of the list, right? And so all of a sudden rent, this thing that actually keeps you housed, gets bumped down. And the same is true with medical expenses. The same is true, honestly, with gifts for kids around the holidays. That gets bumped to the top, and it should, right? And so it's not a question of whether or not people are able to manage their finances. They can manage their finances, right? It's just a question that there's no backstop, right? There's no moment where it's like, well, this is an especially tough month. Good thing I have $500 in the bank, right? That doesn't happen.
Yeah. So Dan, I hope to turn to you now. I mean, can you give a sense of the costs of not addressing volatility?
So the costs are pretty hard to get to. Partly it's when you can't deal with it. In some sense, everything that goes on in the homeless system is driven by volatility. There are 500 families approximately in New York City today that are not homeless and that will be homeless next month. Maybe 500, maybe 600, something in that order of magnitude. Why are they not homeless today, and why will they be homeless next month? Because something happened. And something happened is what economists talk about as volatility. And all of these stories are about volatility. Volatility, if you can recover from it, is not a problem, but many people don't have the ability to recover from it. It puts them in untenable positions. They get evicted. They have to go live somewhere else. They have to have these expenses. Either they have the expenses or the city has the expenses. They pay late fees. They run into trouble on their other bills. So things can cascade, especially if you have one or two bad pieces of luck in a row.
And Molly, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you alluded to this in the introductory presentation, but there is real research between the relationship between socioeconomic status, stress, and then larger health outcomes, right? And simply being low income is a stressor. Low income with volatility, and the two very often go hand in hand, is an additional stressor, and that really manifests itself in people's physical and mental well-being. There's a fair amount of evidence that homelessness in and of itself is a trauma, right? And that's a trauma that affects people's decision-making abilities, affects people's, children's ability to thrive, but children's ability to learn. So I think there's a very real human cost associated with all of this, in addition to sort of the very frankly obvious cost of the agency that I work for, right? This is homelessness in of itself is a burden on not only on the families, which is sort of our first priority, but on the taxpayers as well. Volatility is a compounding factor, right? At the end of the day, this is about income, period. Income volatility is not a problem if you have money in the bank, but if you are very low income volatility is certainly a compounding factor. And I think there's huge both taxpayer and human ramifications for having that kind of inequality and volatility.
So Adrian, I want to turn to you, and you used to run the DC Public Housing Authority, and you have a lot of experience. First, can you just talk a little bit about what you've seen on the ground, especially in that kind of public housing population?
I thought it was very interesting to hear Steve mention how families respond to the holidays, because it's so true. I remember in my old job, we would have a recognition across our entire tenant portfolio that it was the holiday time. And so rent was going to be late in January. And that was just the norm. And so we instead of sort of reacting to that in a negative way, we acknowledged it and worked around it, knowing that most families would catch up. in weeks or the following month. And I think that that's the kind of responsibility that sometimes we have as mission-driven housers on what's happening inside the family household. I think another thought that comes to mind in terms of how families, at least in DC's public housing, although I suspect it's probably public housing across the country, is why some folks who probably can afford, there are some folks who can make a decision to leave assisted housing, not many, but some, stay. And in speaking to some of those, typically women, heads of households in my experience, they were concerned about what happens when I lose my job. And so there's one woman in particular I can think of, made about $65,000, lived in one of the toughest sites in Washington, D.C., like really a difficult place to live. And I would say to her every couple of years, I said, you know, why are you still here? You know, we can help you in a homeownership program. We can help you and your family move out. And she said, you know, I am afraid. I am scared. I am 56 years old. What happens if I lose my job? And so there are actual decision points that families will make that for some of us, like, it doesn't make sense. If you make that kind of money, you shouldn't live in distressed public housing. But folks are making decisions because of just not being concerned about what the future holds. And when you think about the entire resident pool of families who live in public housing and that Section 8 tenant-based voucher program, on average, they're making $15,000 a year. So that salary is an anomaly in many cases. $15,000 a year. Most of that income is fixed across all residents, so SSI, Social Security. Another 34% or so is from wages. Another 29% is from TANF. So while there's a diversity of income even inside the household, there is still this concern that any number of those things could tilt, and there could be some kind of event that creates a shock to the family.
Dan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, so Adrian points out that the fear of volatility affects people's decisions in ways that are not socially desirable. That works for other actors in the housing market as well. One of the big problems that people who are leaving homelessness have is finding someone who will rent an apartment to them. What is that fear? The fear is the fear part of landlords that they will be unable to meet the rent. They may be able to meet the rent at the moment, but the landlords are afraid of the volatility of the net income of people who are formerly homeless or who have different kinds of disabilities. And it's not the actual income, but the fear of the volatility. So you have other people who other decisions that are made the wrong way because there is no insurance mechanism for them.
Yeah, so that's a great transition because I think we should talk about the implications of this on the housing provider side. So Adrian, again, having run the DC Housing Authority, you have firsthand experience as a landlord and an especially affected population. So are there particular issues that come up with this payment volatility for the public housing authorities?
And with this, I think it's easy to represent most of my members across the country who are also landlords. NARO is a membership organization, and our members are housing authorities and housing providers and developers, and landlords who own and operate Section 8 housing across the country. So I think it's a shared experience. And I used to meet with our advocate groups locally all the time. And I would say to them, I got to tell you, eviction is bad business for me. There is a cost to the family, but quite frankly, there is a cost to us as a landlord. Because think about what's all involved. And there's obviously legal costs. So you have to actually go to court and to evict somebody. There's a cost to that. And keep in mind, we're talking about, in this case, housing authorities that already have stretched dollars. They are not receiving all of the resources that it takes to actually operate the housing that they have. So legal costs. But on top of that, there's also turning the unit around, which anybody who's ever managed housing knows that there is a cost to that. I think the National Apartment Association members average that cost out to be about $1,000 at its base, and then kind of goes up from there. And some of the experience that I had, I know my members have, is when a family owes you rent, they're least likely to call in a work order. Think about that, right? When a family owes rent, they don't really want you to be inside of the unit, my experience, and several others. And so there's maintenance costs that are occurring, that are evolving inside the unit that the landlord may be unaware of. And so you sometimes enter the unit, and instead of routine wear and tear, you can throw a coat of paint on the wall, there's some higher maintenance needs that are going on inside the unit. And then in addition to that, you now have to find another family to go into the unit as well, which there is a cost involved. And the maintenance staff that would typically do routine maintenance are now working on the turnover as well. So it's not, from an economic standpoint, it's just not good business for some landlords. Now, a landlord will say, but I got to get the next tenant to pay rent. And this is true. That is a business decision as well. But my experience has been is that if we were able to keep a family stabilized, it was just a better outcome in the long run.
And so, Steve, you mentioned your organization provides affordable housing. Maybe you could now switch that hat you mentioned.
Sure.
Just
Am I supposed to
put
offer
it
the
on.
rebuttal here?
No.
I will offer the rebuttal. No, so we manage about 1,200 apartments, all affordable, and we built them with a number of different programs funded by the federal government, city government, state government. And so, you know, when I think about that work, and I make a joke sometimes that there are people who work on our housing management side who don't want to talk to the people who work on our social service side. And that's because the people that work in social services are concerned 100% with making sure people stay in housing. That's their goal, right? And they will do anything that they can do to make sure a family stays in an apartment. And our property management people and our rent collection people are concerned 100% with making sure that people collect rent. And they're concerned with that because if you don't collect rent, you can't run a building. And so, you know, the way that we finance these things is important. It's wonky and crazy, but it's important because we finance these things to break even. So if I have a 150-unit apartment building in Brooklyn, I'm not making any money off of it. So it's funny to talk about volatility, and I can talk about our nonprofit volatility, right? If I have a vacancy rate that I financed it at, and that's supposed to be 5%, and I'm actually losing 12% of the rent in a given month, I don't have enough money to operate the building. And not having enough money to operate the building means that preventative maintenance doesn't get done. It means that boilers don't get changed out. It means that we start drawing down on our replacement reserves. It means that all the things that you need to do to help the 93% of the families who are all low income, who are all living with you, live happy lives in their buildings, you can't do. And so then you have two choices, right? You can either go out and try to raise money for a building that should break even, which is a really difficult thing to do, or you can try to get people to pay rent. And so, you know, the way that we operate at the beginning of our organization's existence was to not worry about rent. We were an organization that tried to deal with affordable housing the same way that we ran our shelters. And so we flooded services into the shelters. We told people not to worry about rent. We tried to stabilize families. And the strange thing that happened was that people stopped paying rent. And people not paying rent is bad both because they need to pay rent because we need the money, and also because it creates an environment in these buildings where people don't take care of the buildings as much because they don't respect the fact that this is an affordable housing building with a lease and a key and rent that needs to be paid. And so one of the things that we had to do, which was counterintuitive and really actually took a lot of screaming and yelling in a conference room in the basement of our building, was how do we create an environment where people pay rent? And one of the ways that we did that actually was splitting and saying, here's a property management person, that person's job is to collect rent. That person will badger you. That person will, after the 15-day grace period, come and give you a letter. That person will, after the 45-day grace period, initiate court proceedings, do all the things that a landlord would do. And so that person was the rent collection person. And then on every one of our sites, there's the social service person. And so then the social service person gets to be the person who fights against the rent collection person. And it actually works, right? So then you have an ally, and you have a person who's in charge of the business. And for our buildings, all of our rent collections went up, and we actually didn't see a ton of turnover. We didn't see a ton of people being evicted. And so we can talk about it a little bit later, but in our business, there's a difference between being firm about rent collection, even sometimes initiating eviction proceedings, and actually evicting people. Because I absolutely agree with Adrian that evictions are terrible for the people that we work with. They're terrible for the populations that we want to serve. But at some point, as a landlord, you need to figure out how, and this is an awful thing to say, and I can't believe I'm saying it, but you have to figure out how to get
So I pushed you
rent.
to the right that way.
Yeah, I know, right? But you have to figure out how to get rent bumped up on the list of priorities.
Right.
And if you never evict people, rent will always be at the bottom of the list of priorities, which is a problem if you want to manage a
Right.
prime building.
And I agree. I think that eviction is clearly the last option, but we do work with families to try to make sure that they are paying their rent and on time. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll agree there.
Yeah. And so, Molly, I mean, you have a lot of experience, nonprofit housing organization. You led the investment in affordable housing at HPD. Have you seen how this volatility affects either building operations, how buildings are financed, or other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything I can say here is really piggybacking off of things that have been said, but just to tie it back to housing finance and wearing my old hat, right? Everything that the city of New York does in the housing finance world is underwrites to a 5% vacancy rate. There aren't very few affordable housing projects in the city of New York that are literally running a 5% vacancy rate. There's just too much demand for affordable housing here in the city. But what that is a 5% basically financial vacancy, right? It's accounting for the collection loss. If we could underwrite to a 2% vacancy rate or a 3% vacancy rate, that's less subsidy and more affordable housing. I mean, that's a sort of a gross oversimplification, but at the end of the day, right, that the need to build in that assumption about rent loss does affect the amount of affordable housing development that happens in the city of New York. I also want to sort of piggyback from the landlord perspective. I do think that income volatility does very much play into source of income discrimination. And I don't want to minimize it. I think very often source of income discrimination is a mask behind which the lowest and most basis forms of prejudice is hiding. But I think also there is a real fear on landlords' behalf, as was mentioned before, that people aren't going to be able to pay the rent on an ongoing basis, right? And that is what manifests itself in source of income discrimination. So while we can pursue it on a legal basis, and it is now illegal, statewide, and I think that's really important and promising, but it's a particularly hard form of discrimination to go after, except in the most obvious cases. And I think because it does tie into people's to spotty rent history, and that does affect landlords' decision-making. I think it's really challenging.
So, Dan, I'd like to turn to you. You've written a bit about how landlords do react to these risks and how they might mitigate them. So, does this create additional inefficiencies across the market, or what is your insight into that?
Okay, so it does create an additional inefficiency because what each landlord finds to be in her own best interest is actually moving the people who have spotty rent histories to another landlord. People end up somewhere. And in many cases, there are other landlords. You're playing hot potato rather than you're creating something new and different. You're not reducing the amount of risk. You're moving the risk to someone else. Usually another landlord, sometimes the city. And so this discrimination it does not prevent the person from existing, and they're going to be somewhere. So it's just a totally inefficient thing. The landlord is not creating any value for society by moving people around.
So, and Steve, can I ask, I mean, does that resonate with you? I mean, do you feel like you are how do you think about the risk of a tenant, or what type of screening mechanisms do you see in your portfolio or across the market that actually kind of account for some of that?
Sure. So, there's two sides. On the shelter side and the home-based side, one of the things we do is try to rapidly rehouse people, right? And this concept of source of income discrimination and discrimination in general against the people that we serve is huge. And it's a thing that you encounter every day when you're going out with a family and touring sites and trying to figure out, and our people, our housing specialists who are really good at this, have lists of landlords who are friendly to our people, right? And it shouldn't be that way. You shouldn't have to have, well, there's 3 people in the Bronx and there's a building in Queens that's really works for the people, then we can always, that's crazy. These are people with subsidies. These are people who have guaranteed money behind them, and landlords are still not okay with that. And I think Molly put her finger on it. There's a tremendous amount of prejudice and discrimination that exists just underneath that, right? And you can say, well, I don't want to deal with FEPS. Everybody knows how that's complicated. Or I don't want to deal with Section 8. That's complicated, right? But
Can you explain FEPS to everybody? Just
No, I can't.
Can anyone explain FEPS?
Molly, can you explain FEPS?
Sure, it's the city-funded rent subsidy. It is for most folks. There are a variety of eligibility criteria, the variety of different substreams in there, but it is for families and individuals in the shelter system or facing eviction. You can also get it if you haven't actually come into the shelter system, but but come into a home-based program.
And I'll do a plug too. When you have these confusing moments of acronyms or programs in the housing world, we actually created a directory at the Furman Center, so you usually can find a description of them. So,
Yeah, but,
Go
the
ahead.
problem with FEPS is that they changed FEPS and then named it FEPS, which is confusing. One has an H and one doesn't have an H. You don't pronounce them differently.
good point.
This is the real issue of the day.
Right. Yeah, so this is hugely
this is-
informative to everyone in the room. So that's from the placement side. From the housing side, we work really hard to not think about those things, and a lot of our referrals come either directly from shelter or they come from Housing Connect or any of the other ways that we get referrals from the city. We pride ourselves on screening for as little as we possibly can, because what we want to do is give people a chance at permanent housing, and we honestly haven't found much correlation between the things that a landlord would typically screen for and tenancy and people paying their rent on time and all of those things. So, as a policy position, we don't do that stuff.
Right. And can I just add something I heard Dan say, which is compelling, which we routinely would get requests and concerns from landlords who are involved in the Section 8 program, the tenant-based voucher program, saying, why can't you all create a list of the bad tenants? So there's a list of the bad landlords. I mean, there's a list of the bad landlords, right? You know this family has had a voucher for 10, 15 years. They've been a bad actor for at least most of those years. Why didn't you tell me that this occurred? And to your point, it just sort of goes keep kicking the can down the road, at least from the landlord's perspective.
So we're going to move into talking about how current rental assistance policies actually deal with income and expense volatility. But before we do that, everybody has little note cards on your seat. If you have any questions that you want the panel to answer in our Q&A portion, please write a note on that, and you'll see Furmaners around that will take them. Okay, so our two largest sources of housing assistance are public housing and housing choice vouchers. They're designed so that people pay 30% of their income on rent, and in theory, this provides protection against volatility, because as the household income goes down, so too does the rent payment. We're kind of interested in does that actually work in the context of issues we're talking about. So, Adrian, can we start with you?
So at least in the history of public housing, the concept of paying 30% of your income is a modern concept, if you consider modern being going back to the early 70s or so. In public housing, in the voucher program, lady. When public housing began, folks paid rent. They paid was considered market rent. And as the rules around that system of housing changed, so came the concept of just having, leaning into families who were the lowest of income and then really capping out how much rent they could pay. And the 30%, and maybe somebody out there has a better history card than I do on this one, the 30% was kind of arbitrary. It was sort of, hey, 30% sounds good. I'm sure there was a lot more thought behind, but basically it came down to that. And does it work? So it works in the framework of this conversation in that it is adaptable to a household's income, right? If your income goes up, in theory it goes up, your income goes down, your rent goes down. But in the sense of the decision point that families make inside of that 30% of income becoming your rent means that family members often will not add income to the equation. So what does that mean? They might not add a new spouse to the lease. They may not add the adult child that's moved back home to the lease. Some families may not report additional income to the housing agency. And and these are ways that families are, making smart economic household decisions for themselves about how they want additional income to be used. And maybe it is to keep step with additional medical costs and the costs for Christmas gifts and other household expenses. I think that it works, again, in the framework of what we're talking about today. Does it work from a larger social scheme of wanting to make sure that families are incentivized to bring more income into the household? I think that there's a question mark I would add to that.
Yeah, and there's criticism of the formula to be, it is a disincentive to seek employment income, and HUD has actually signaled some desire to move away from that approach. They funded a large rent reform demonstration, and they're proposing new reforms in a set of PHAs.
And there's also a small group of housing authorities across the country that have something called a moving to work designation, and many of those have played with ways to create incentives for families who might not have recorded additional income to do so without the rent amount going up at all or immediately.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to add?
So economists love to talk about the disincentive effects of the 30% on income, and so economists have talked about that forever. However, economists now love to do data and love to actually check on whether what they're saying does make sense. And there have been a considerable number of studies to look at the work disincentive of the 30%, and the findings on those are all pretty much zero.
You should come work at a housing authority.
You send those studies. So Molly, I mean, if feel free to add what you want, but if housing assistance does move to kind of a less connection between income and rent, if this rent reform kind of does take off, are we moving away from addressing shocks?
I mean, I think I'm equally ambivalent on the disconnect as Adrian was on the connection. For most of development programs, there isn't a particularly specific connection. There is at the point of move-in, but then rent is rent, and families' income changes around that. And I think it has two arguable downsides. One is certainly when a family experiences a negative shock, loss of income or significant increase in expenses, that you end up having families who are living in affordable housing who are still really rent burdened, and that is obviously a huge problem. The flip side is a lot more complicated. On the one hand, I think we all want households to grow and flourish, and being in affordable housing can be the foundation upon which income growth then happens. And that is terrific, except that also because we don't have a great pathway and in New York City and elsewhere in the country, right, to move to different options for housing, right? In New York City, the housing is so scarce across all different segments, or almost all segments of the market, right? That family is likely gonna stay where they are, right? There isn't a great path to affordable home ownership, something like that. So when we have extremely scarce affordable housing resources, you have a family that is now moderate middle income staying in that development. Depending on who you talk to and what day, that is both a pro and a con. So I'm not going to try and define that one, but it is, I do think it would be, in the long term, something to think about how we can have a pathway for families who have grown and who could be ready to move out of supportive housing, of affordable housing, I think is something that is worth thinking about from a policy perspective. Certainly, from a planning perspective, from a taxpayer budgeting perspective, saying the rent is the rent makes it a substantially easier program to finance and I'm using program in sort of the most generic way, but thinking about what do we need to commit for affordable housing, it's a whole lot easier to size that number if we are talking about a fixed number. There's a reason that the HUD budget at this point is basically the public housing and Section 8 budget, right, is because these are, when you are sticking with tenant income, 30% of income as rent, right, those become really ongoing financial needs. I'm very torn on this one, but I think it does have real financial implications. I did also just sort of want to circle back a little bit to some of the FEPS conversation. With FEPS and other subsidized placements, since the start of this administration, DHS has moved, I think it's close to at this point about 120,000 people out of shelter into subsidized placements. And the return rate on that, it varies a little bit depending on which of those programs that you're talking about, but it's well under 5%, right? Subsidized placements, just no matter what landlords may think about them, are a really effective way of helping low-income families achieve stability.
Dan, do you want to add something?
And it's difficult to say this in New York City, but 30% is kind of high for many families for rent. The average in the United States of what people spend on housing is well below 30%. And what really matters on how much that bites is what you have left over. So Bill Gates could live very, very well spending 99% of his income on housing. It's what you have left over, and so poorer families need to spend something on food. Food is really good stuff. They need to spend something on clothing. They need to spend something on education for their kids. And that's what the 70% goes for. And 70% of not a lot is less than not a lot.
So, for the panel, and maybe Adrian, we'll start with you. Are there better ways to actually address or to reform these housing programs than what we're talking about and better address volatility?
So I mentioned what we called our housing lab inside of the assisted housing platform of a small group of housing providers that have a special designation by HUD, really by Congress, but through HUD, to really think about these issues and are looking at ways to create more predictability amongst families inside of their units on what rent will be. The rent calculation process is only eclipsed by doing your taxes. It is very, very hard to do. It's hard on the families. It's equally as hard on the individual who has to calculate rent. And with that comes some sense of, for some families, I've made this income, but I have all these deductibles, and I added a child to the household. What does this all mean? One of the things that some of the housing agencies are doing is trying to create a rent platform that feels more predictable to the family. It's not about all of the receipts that you can conjure up showing your medical expenses. It is just a flat amount. Now, when I say that, you think 30% is the flat amount, but it's really 30% of an adjusted income with all of these bells and whistles in between. So some agencies are toying with that idea of what if it's just 25%, just that flat amount. Nothing else is taken off the top or comes off the bottom. So there's more predictability embedded in it. Other agencies are looking at tiered rents where, based on your tenure or perhaps the size of your unit, determines what the rent is. So it feels more predictable to the family and disassociates it with income. Is that the best solution in terms of what we're talking about today? I'm not sure. But in terms of what ways to simplify the process for families so it's not this anxiety-ridden exercise each and every year. It's easier for seniors on a fixed income, so for most seniors or on Social Security. But it creates some anxiety within the household about how do we look at our income going up and down and what will we have to pay for rent next year.
Yeah. And if I can ask a follow-up, right now, do your members have flexibility to be able to do that?
No.
Or?
I mean, so 39 of them do. And so we think there.
What do they have in common
There's
with
about
each other?
3,100 housing authorities across the country. 39 of them have this special designation. Most of them do not. And so they have to play by the existing HUD rules. And so that does create a difficult framework because when you're working inside of a government program, you have to follow the rules or really bad things happen to the agency and to the individual that broke the rules. And so time to time, you have to do sort of the house cite rules. People have seen that movie. The one example I can think of that may or may have happened to an executive director of a large Eastern Seaboard housing authority is that there was a household, a mom and her daughter. The daughter had gone off to college, got a job, was doing really well. And was in an internship, really, in terms of her post-undergraduate work, and had not reported her income. The mom had not reported the income to the housing authority that the adult child had, who was still on the lease but not living at home because they're in an academic situation that's allowed. So we didn't have the income. We went to the mom, said, you've got to pay. We being a collective we in the housing industry again. We said we have to collect this past income from you because we now see that you earned it. We need to get 30% of that. And the mom couldn't pay it. And so we collectively had to move to evict the mom. The daughter came in and said, hey, this is my fault. I can't afford to pay the rent either. And so, so this individual, this director back in the day, said, what do you do in this situation, right? This is a heartbreaking situation. You don't want to evict mom. You don't want to penalize an adult daughter for being successful. And so this particular director told the family, sue me. If you sue, then I can the director, can come out on the other end with a settlement that takes care of the family. Very inefficient, perhaps more expensive, but still, when you think about the inability to make choices like that on a day-to-day basis in the real world and have your hands tied as a housing provider is difficult. And there are many people out there who would like to be able to make those kind of pivots and can't.
Yeah. Molly, do you want to add any ideas?
Sure. And I think the gold standard way of managing through income volatility is having some savings. And that is a whole lot easier said than done when you are starting with an extremely low income to begin with. But for under state regulation, the Department of Homeless Services are required to have an income savings program. So it has existed in sort of various forms for a while. We are rolling out a new version for families starting in the first quarter of 2020. I think, it is certainly very controversial, and I don't know that this is the right forum to sort of go down that particular pathway, but I will say, given that it is required under state law, that is sort of the starting point. And I do think that in the best case scenario, right, that this is an opportunity to help families while they are in shelter, right, while they have, while rent is not a cost for them, to build up hopefully a little bit of savings that becomes that a tiny little piece of the buffer. I think it's something that that is going to be we're moving forward with, and I think we will learn from it as we go forward. There is a program sort of akin to that in the Section 8 world, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, right, where as families' incomes go up, they pay the higher share of their rent, but there is also a deposit for them into a savings account, and after a fixed period of time, they graduate from the program and can leave. When I was running Section 8 at HPD a few years ago, right, average savings on that was something in the few $1,000s range, which isn't going to, in the grand scheme of housing costs in New York City, it's not a down payment, it's not that much, but if you compare it to the, number of people who can't access a $400, the savings for a $400 sudden charge, that's a really significant amount of money.
So that's a great segue for us to think more broadly about addressing net income volatility. So I'll do another plug for cards and questions. I think we're still taking them. And so thinking about complementary tools that might help at these moments where people need it, the income shock or the expense shock, without it being built into the subsidy itself. I mean, are there models of smoothing, as we have referred to it, or protecting against these shocks that are worth discussing? So, Molly, the city has a version of the one-shot program, so maybe you can give some insight into that.
Sure, I'm speaking now for a sister agency, the Human Resources Administration, that administers rent arrears grants. They distribute about 58,000 per year, so it's a very robust program. Median amount is about $3,900. There's a fair amount of responsiveness to individual circumstances built into that. Households have to be at or below 200% of the poverty level, and it's only available to households that have documented citizens or documented immigration status. So it's not a completely, solve every problem kind of tool by a long shot, but there is room in there for to size amounts based on what's going to be needed to keep people housed, to address people's individual circumstances. And there's evidence that a very small number of people who receive the grants actually enter shelter within the follow-up period. So I think it is a really important tool in our toolbox. Not going to solve every problem, but it's really important.
Yeah. Steve, have you had experience with it? Have you seen it work?
Yeah, and I think, as Molly was talking about, the one-shot deals are godsends for people who are about to be evicted, and they save tenancy. They save tenancy for people who are in eviction proceedings. We run a similar program that's also funded by the city called Homebase, which has different rules about eligibility and sort of different things that you're allowed to spend money on. But the basic idea behind that program is that there should be this sort of flexible pool of money to get people the things they need to remain housed. Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to do, right? If you need medical expenses, if you need to fix a car, all of these things that exist in the world that can allow you to jump back on and stay stable in housing, Homebase theoretically can pay for those things. And Dan's going to disagree with me because he's actually done all the data on this, and I just run the program. The problem with Homebase is both that it's too far downstream, and also that moving it farther upstream makes it way too expensive. So if you think about it, in our program, and we cover 50% of the Bronx in 3 or 4 different sites that we run in the Bronx, we see about 6,000 clients that come in the door in a given year. We're only allowed to serve 3,600 of them, and we have this big questionnaire that you go through to say whether or not you can be served. And the questionnaire, what the questionnaire is trying to do is identify the people who are the neediest, right? And so actually what we're trying to do is move farther downstream. So the people that are the least needy are the people that the city and we have predicted won't end up in shelter, the people that will get on their feet some way. Now, getting on your feet some way is not great, right? That might mean getting evicted and ending up doubled up. That might mean scraping it together and sort of figuring out in housing court how to get resources, but it just means you won't hit the shelter system. And so, you know, one of the things that we have to figure out is how do you target interventions upstream while also not spending $1 billion targeting interventions to people who actually would figure it out in a month. And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know if anybody else has the answer to that. But ideally, you know, in the data that we've found, being evicted, landlord discord, moving a lot, not having a signed lease, all the things that happen to make you eligible are also the things that put you at high risk to end up in the shelter system, right? So it's this weird calculus where you're trying to figure out, are you needy enough to get help? And have you fallen to a point where you're vulnerable enough and gone through enough and are poor enough that we can then intervene? And ideally, you wouldn't wait that. You'd find someone who needed a little bit of income smoothing, who was about to miss rent, and figure out how to give a little nudge at that point. But the problem is that there are, let's say there are 2 million of those people in a given month, and 1.95 million of them will figure it out, right?
Dan, do you want to disagree with Steve?
I don't want to disagree with Steve.
All right.
But he has to.
But I won't disagree with Steve. I agree with you that I believe the questionnaire on home base is pretty bad, but that's a different issue. That's an econometric issue. But the problem is that there is what we're talking about is a thing that affects lots and lots of people. And if you want to affect lots and lots of people, then what you have to do is rather cheap on each one. You'll notice if you turn around or actually turn to that side over there, there are 3 exit signs in this room. Why are there exit signs in this room? The exit signs in this room are to prevent our deaths should there be a fire in this room. That is a very good thing to do. And that is expensive to have those exit signs there. It's not it's not going to break NYU to have them up there and have them on. But that is a rather cheap way of dealing with something that is kind of unlikely. I believe that it's rather unlikely that if those exit signs were not there, I would not burn up this morning. But I prefer not to take a chance. And you guys would prefer not to take a chance. That is fire prevention, which is done to many, many people. And this is how the city of New York has decided that we want to keep people from being killed in fires. So we're going to, rather than try to predict where a fire will be and station a fire truck outside this building when the algorithm predicts there's a high probability that D'Agostino Hall will have a fire, what they've done, understandably, is say, put exit signs so you got something to go. That's cheap, that deals with everybody, and we don't think of it as a great waste. Although probably the cost of building to fire code in buildings like this far exceeds the cost of running a homeless program for New York City. Keeping things like those exit signs on and putting them there, having doors that go outwards rather than inwards. So we do spend a lot of money. I think what we should be thinking about is a rather wide program, especially in places like New York City, that provides a little bit of help for people when they run into a little bit of trouble. Upstream, yes, There are great difficulties in how you design it. The more generous you make it, the more money it costs, and also the greater the moral hazard problems. People will come and say that, people will come and act like people do when they have an exam in my class and talk about all the terrible things that happened to them last night and why they didn't do well on their exam. I try not to have friends of mine have children in my class because there's an incredible mortality rate of people, of the parents of people who take my classes. So we need to avoid these, and I think that's what the design challenge is. I don't think that the housing authorities are the best people to be in the income support business. And that's what Adrian is talking about. They want to calculate rent. And there are other ways of dealing with that. The more they make the rent inflexible and taking away their risk, then the risk goes on to the tenants unless there's somebody else to take the risk. And that's what we're talking about there. And each of these cases is trying to find ways to take risks, not the most generous kinds of things. We're talking some days about, no, okay, so you got 3 months, you can go a couple of $1,000s over your head, and then you have to pay it back. Things like DC Flex, where you have some responsibility, not 100% free money in all cases, but give ways to increase flexibility as increasing flexibility rather than making landlords your bankers. The best way to lose a friend is to lend money to them. And if you want to be friends with your landlord, you shouldn't be borrowing from your landlord.
I'm
Adrian?
so happy to have so many life lessons here this morning. I didn't know that. That would be part of getting me up here from DC. So I would suggest that some of the strategies that our members are taking on in creating simplicity in the rent structure actually is a huge benefit to the residents. And let me tell you why. Often, when rent is not calculated accurately, or when there is additional income in the household that is not presented because rent goes up when income goes up. Families can be evicted for not paying that back rent that was not reported. So it's not as though if Ms. Johnson had a part-time job or a full-time job during the holidays, it didn't go reported. Ms. Johnson didn't think anybody would find out about the job. Of course, the government agency finds out about the job, goes back to Ms. Johnson and say, you owe us an additional $600 for back rent. Most agencies will do a payment plan. Let's figure out how you pay down the $600 over some course of time. But if Ms. Johnson doesn't pay her rent, and then on top of that, the $600 over some course of time, she too is subject to eviction. If she doesn't pay the $600, she is subject to eviction. So some of these strategies that are involved are saying, Ms. Johnson, if you happen to get that part-time job, unless that part-time job reflects a 10%, 15% increase in what your income is, what your rent would be, we don't even want to know about it. Be well, use it where you need to. So there's a huge benefit on the side of families as well that it's not just passing the stress point along to the owners. Molly mentioned the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. This is one of the best programs that exists in the assisted housing system. Right now, it is mostly public housing agencies and families run a tenant-based voucher program, but it is a strategy that any landlord, the project-based side, can use as well. I won't go into the description. Molly did that very adequately. But if we think about that program, right now it's tied to very aspirational goals. I would like to own a house. I would like to send my child to college. Sometimes I need a car that can transport me to where the jobs are. But imagine if there was something that was a FSS light, where it's just really creating that $400 in the escrow so that if there is a shock to the family, they're able to rebound. I think that is something where it's nothing off of the apparatus that's called, assisted governments, and it is a huge benefit for those families should something occur to them, and it can be system-wide.
That's excellent. So any final thoughts before we move to audience questions? Okay, great. So right when you were talking about family self-sufficiency, I got handed a card exactly about family self-sufficiency. So let me just make sure that you covered this person's question. So on FSS, people tap escrowed savings account. Can people tap this account for emergency needs? And are there reforms to the program that would make it a more useful tool?
So my experience has been is that it usually can't be tapped for emergency. Families usually create goals when they sign up for the program, and it's usually you can tap into the escrow when that goal is being achieved, or when you graduate, you get the full amount of the escrowed amount. So if over the course of 3 or 4 years you've saved up $10,000, $15,000, that's the check that you walk away with. There might be other models out there where it's created that you can tap it for an emergency basis, but unless it was built into the family goal, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, HPD's version, I know you can get some interim access under specific circumstances before you graduate. Particularly, I think there may be some emergency, and then also particularly if you can relate it to your goal, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
you're building towards employment, you need a car to get to your job, you can actually tap the funds before you graduate, things like that.
Great. So a question on security deposits, which is the mechanism I think we're all familiar with. It's a form of insurance on the landlord side. So the question is about how landlords deal with rent loss by requiring these security deposits. Could the panel talk about whether these actually work well or what we know, and the changes that could be useful in the whole system we use around security deposits? Maybe Dan, I'll start with you.
Okay, so, okay, that is what I know about security deposits on an economic sense of whether they work well or not. I can repeat it several times in the next 10 seconds. We don't know exactly what they do and how they work. It does seem like, I mean, it's clearly a way of dealing, holding a tenant accountable. It reduces moral hazard. Its goals are pretty clear. Though it has become rather strange in the sense that it's basically held in a no interest account. And it can't be accessed for collateral for either the tenant or the landlord. So it is a large gift to the banks that we have worked out in ways that keep it that basically because landlords don't trust tenants and tenants don't trust landlords. It's an expensive way of creating trust. It also means that when, if you think about developing a large project, something like that, the landlord has to set aside money which bears no interest, at the same time has to bear a large part of the day-to-day burden of rent non-payment. So it doesn't deal with that very well. There are many alternative ways of dealing with it. It could be done. There are many other ways that people establish trust besides setting aside a non-interest-bearing security account. In Australia, for instance, most states have the security deposit going to the government and coming back in those senses. In the Northern Territories of Australia, if the landlord gets the security deposit, the landlord cannot leave the state while holding the security deposit. so the security deposits end up in the possession of realtors and other kinds of things. It doesn't seem, it should be pretty easy to come up with better things than security deposits. If, for instance, there was a third party guaranteeing rent, as there are a number of programs that are moving in that direction, then the security deposit could be considerably reduced. The security deposit serves a physical purpose to deal with damage, but the rent part, if you can have a guarantee. Security deposits are really a good way to run a business in the 19th century.
And based on, I think, what you said before we started Q&A and this, we've seen, private market products pop up to provide guarantees for people that are international or low credit score or something like that. But we haven't seen this yet kind of be a benefit for lower income households. Is there maybe some way to think about renter payment insurance? We're spending some time thinking about that.
So I mean, we do see in most Australian states, not the Northern Territories, that there are facilities to lend security deposits to people in various circumstances. There are also a program in France to encourage mobility that lends security deposits from the government. And Homebase provides security deposits, One Shots provides security deposits. So it's moving in that direction. Renter payment insurance, we see versions of that everywhere. There are some, the distinctions are, I think, twofold, and they work together. If you want to guarantee a third-party guaranteeing payment of rent, the key dimensions are under what circumstances do they make the payment? Will they pay the rent? If you make it very narrow, that you must have a job loss that can be verified by 18 witnesses, and it must occur on a Friday in November, then you won't deal with many of the problems, because a lot of the reasons why people need money, run into problems, a lot of the volatility comes from things which are undescribable ahead of time, or which are incredibly difficult to verify. The death of a loved one. I mean, so that you have that kind of problem. So if you go very narrow on that side, you won't cover many of the problems. If you go very broad, you run into some severe problems of people who shouldn't be getting the money get the money. On the other hand, the other question is how much of the money for the rent payment is due back from the tenant after the fact. Do you spread it out like landlords do over a year or something like that, in which is all back? Or is it like an insurance payment, a pure insurance payment, where you get it and you don't pay anything back? If somebody hits my car and they give me an insurance payment, I don't owe them anything back. You trade off one for the other. You can make things more liberal on the front side of what sort of activities you do if you make them stricter on how much you have to pay back. So you could have systems that lend you the small amounts of money, no questions asked, that you have to pay back. There are a number of systems like that, or you could have systems which give you money in well-defined circumstances, like an insurance policy, which you don't have to pay back, or which you only have to pay back a piece. The trick is finding the sweet spots where that work.
So we've kind of touched on this, but another concept here is the use of credit and how credit interacts with the market. So it's for Help USA, but I think it actually applies to Adrian and Molly as well. So Steve, do you have experience allowing tenants to report on-time rent, in their credit reports as a means to increasing rent payments, or I presume also increasing people's credit scores?
No, but I think it's a great idea. And the idea that you would report on-time rent as essentially as a marker for good credit is a great idea. And it's something that we talked about yesterday, and I don't know what the mechanisms are to do that, but if somebody does, and you could come talk to me afterwards, I'd love to have that conversation.
I know
Adrian,
that,
have
I
you seen
know
it?
that HUD's Office of PD&R, Policy Development and Research, did begin a project a couple years ago, at least they approached a couple housing authorities on it, on having a mechanism to create a credit report for individuals, families who are in the public housing program. So I know that that occurred, and I believe that it actually did, you know, I know they asked housing authorities, I think it did occur, but I think that's a great place to follow up with them.
I mean, the city controller has a pilot program along these lines, and I'm not competent to talk about the details of it, but there is some work on that going on in the city.
Yeah. So the next couple questions are actually on the income side. So the questioner asks, what about programs and policies that focus on income volatility, fair scheduling, universal basic income, living wage, et cetera? I guess another way, why housing?
So I will say, as someone who has been in the housing industry for a long time, when it came to the stability of families, it has always been a concern of mine that the weight of that stability only fell on people inside of the affordable housing industry. So the concept of why is there not more affordable housing? We need more housing. Sometimes my retort is perhaps we also need a salary that folks can afford some of the housing that is here that may be naturally occurring, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody wants to hear that. So I do think that there are other parts of our collective system that has a responsibility for helping with housing affordability and to that degree, income volatility.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we can either be talking about inequality and volatility from the perspective of workforce development and and labor market regulation, or we need an incredibly strong social safety net. Like we can't, and DHS is sort of the epitome of that social safety net. We are there to catch the people who have fallen through every other system. But we wouldn't, you know, talk about further upstream, right? That is the further upstream by definition, if we're going to be thinking about it. But that is if we are not, as a society, prepared to deal with those sets of questions, then we have to have the kind of safety net that I represent.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree with both of those statements. Clearly, labor markets can work in better ways. UBI goes in the opposite direction. UBI is a fixed amount. It doesn't depend on circumstances. If we move in the UBI direction, this discussion becomes even more important.
So the last question is actually about federal policy, but do you think making the Earned Income Tax Credit a monthly disbursement rather than a lump sum fund would help address the income volatility problem? I don't know if anybody here is qualified to respond to
Sounds
that.
like someone's presidential candidate.
Maybe EITC or other kind of on the tax side, maybe is another way to put it.
Now, to a first approximation, I'm not convinced of that because the EITC is proportional to income. The income is proportional to earned income. Earned income is volatile. That will increase your month-to-month volatility. Getting it in April, actually, I think you can probably get it ahead of time depending on how you set your dependents and things like that. So people are if there were a demand for that, I think people would set their dependents so they wouldn't get it in April. You don't have to get,
Get it dispersed.
you can, you do have some freedom on that. And I think it wouldn't change the volatility a whole lot. You wouldn't get the April spike, but everybody knows you get the April spike. So, I mean, I'm not convinced that that would do that much. Not that I've studied it for more than 23 seconds.
That's pretty good. Well, join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion. Thank you. I'll say one more thing. We handed out a brief this morning on housing court trends. I just want people to keep in mind that the scale of this issue is tremendous. Take a look at the brief. Let us know if you have any questions, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the spring. Thanks.